All right, good morning, everyone. It is that time of the morning again for Rogue Mornings. Very excited to be joined today by London Paul. Paul was so nice to email yesterday and offer to join the morning show, and so very excited. Before we jump into things, just want to again, today is Wednesday, August the 9th. August is up and flying quickly. A shout out to our sponsors, myfreedomnow.us. Again, in the event you are in need of credit repair, perhaps you need to refinance, need to get your credit score bounced up a little bit to get a lower interest rate, myfreedomnow.us can help. And then also want to thank mygoldusb.com. Again, if you want to surf online anonymously without government surveillance, you need a portable Bitcoin wallet that can be easily accessible to you. You can plug into any computer, mygoldusb.com. So again, Paul, welcome to Rogue Mornings, and very excited to have you joining.
Yeah, good morning, CJ, and it's an absolute pleasure, and likewise glad that I'm joining you, and we can have a bit of a chat and get each other's insight into some interesting developments, shall we say, that have come about courtesy of Donald Trump.
It's interesting. Before we started, you asked how everything was going, and I said, well, there's never a dull moment here in the United States.
Well, no, that is very true.
We'll,
Yeah.
we'll always have something. We'll always be employed, Paul, because we'll always have something to report on,
Yeah.
in terms of everything that's happening. So, yeah. So let's jump right into it. In terms of yesterday, the escalation, the rhetoric of both Kim Jong Un and Donald Trump. So why don't you share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we have to be a little bit careful with the rhetoric that comes out of North Korea. I mean, there's an argument that says that Kim Jong-un has stated that they're looking to bomb Guam. Well, the reality is it's debatable whether he even said it, but even if he has, they don't have intercontinental ballistic missile capability to hit Guam or anywhere else for that matter. So I think we have to factor that into our thinking. I mean, we spoke before we came on out. There is always the chance in North Korea that as a regime they're under pressure. I mean, the one thing it's rather like Saudi did in Qatar. The one thing nations do when they're under pressure at home is, particularly in certain regions of the world, they'll go and flex their muscles and pretend to bully another nation to give the perception of strength in leadership, and that's never more the case than you would see in North Korea. So I think we have to probably factor that into our thinking. And secondly, of course, Trump came out with some very interesting remarks, which we can kind of dissect. And he went on about the US's nuclear arsenal, and he said, which I thought was quite interesting, when he goes, "My first order as president was to renovate and modernize our nuclear arsenal. It's now far stronger and more powerful than ever before." Well, the reality is that's not true. I mean, there is no way you could revolutionize and modernize a nuclear arsenal in what, 8 months, 7 months? And the fact is, the reality is the US currently spends tens of billions of dollars just to maintain its creaking nuclear arsenal, which is actually quite unstable, which is why they have to keep spending that much just to make sure it doesn't blow up in its own bunkers. I mean, so the idea that they revolutionized and modernized, which would have cost enormous amounts of money, which there was no reference to them ever doing this before, no indication. And of course, the question is, where does the money come from to pay for it? I think that's just more puffing out his chest. And then, of course, he says, well, hopefully we'll never have to use this power. And then makes the worst possible remark where he says, but there will never be a time that we are not the most powerful nation in the world. And this really fundamentally is the biggest problem that the US people face, is that people like Trump genuinely believe this. People in the Senate believe it, the Congress believe it, the Republican parties believe it, the Democrats. They really just think the US remains the strongest nation on the planet. And therefore, this is why, for example, they'll go in and stomp all over Russia with sanctions, why they try to bully China with tariffs and threatening them with sanctions. and seemingly threatening Europe as well by virtue of implementing sanctions on Russia with regards to particularly the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is going to affect energy supplies to Europe. And they just think that Europe will roll over and go, okay, fine, we'll accept your sanctions and we'll just buy your very expensive LNG compared to buying Russia's, which is far cheaper. And it's just an endemic problem that is within the US establishment that they just need to start to realize, this is not reality anymore. And just because you say it doesn't, the rest of the world just doesn't buy it. Well, largely the rest of the world doesn't buy it anymore. And it is very damaging because it's just fanning the flames of rhetoric. Now, if indeed Kim Jong-un did say it, and then Trump's reacted, that is not toning down the rhetoric. That is just stoking it up. And what's going to happen is, does he launch a missile that instead of launching it into the sea, does it actually hit land? I mean, if you wanted to make a statement, all they need to do is, rather than saying we're going to hit Guam, they could just launch a missile into South Korea, and that would have the same effect, because they full well know that if they launched any missile against the US, be it directly or to one of its allies, in inverted commas, be it in this case South Korea, there's going to be a US preemptive strike. And the consequences will be hugely devastating for North Korea and the whole Korean peninsula and beyond, as we know. So I don't place much store that he actually means this. I think it's more to do with weak leadership and a threat at home. Now, I did hear some time ago that there were apparently some US intelligence agents who were captured in North Korea, maybe plotting something, maybe not, maybe it was a reconnaissance mission, maybe it's a fact-finding mission. There is a lot of rhetoric around the US looking to overthrow Kim Jong-un. Now, if that is true, and in fact, I think even his regime has said that was, but maybe that was just, propaganda against the US. But if there's any reality to it, it will be why he keeps flexing his muscles and knowing full well he's got no intention of doing so. The risk, of course, is that the war hawks in Washington will actually start to genuinely believe that this isn't just a threat, and try and take some preemptive strike. Now, I'm not suggesting it'll be a nuclear device, although Trump is kind of making and alluding to that. But once again, that's just hot air. That's just rhetoric. There's no way the US is going to launch a nuclear strike against North Korea. But the risk is they may launch some strike, which is going to provoke North Korea into a response. And from there, you have escalation. And it's always the escalation that's the problem.
Yeah, I'd like to dissect this a little bit as well. And you made some very valid points in terms of who is controlling the information, where is this information coming from, and I can only imagine the amount of potential false intelligence right now that may being reported to the administration. And a perfect example of this, Paul, was yesterday in the majority of the news outlet, and it was kind of perfectly orchestrated that we're reading, quote unquote, Defense Intelligence Agency states that North Korea has already developed miniaturized nuclear weapons that can fit on top of ICBMs. This information just was broadcasted. It was shared every outlet to hype up the condition. And if Trump is receiving these false, bogus intelligence reports, perhaps maybe that is why, if indeed he did come out with this statement against North Korea. But I have to believe, until I see either a press conference or Trump to go live on national television and speak exactly his feelings of what is happening. I honestly don't know what to believe right now when it comes from any of the MSM.
Well, that's an extremely good point, and absolutely. I mean, the issue of, I mean, it's kind of very suspicious when you see this whole kind of chain of, or of events whereby, yeah, there's something come out. Oh, they've got nuclear capability and they can bolt it onto an intercontinental ballistic missile, and then suddenly we're going to bomb Guam, and then Trump comes out with the rhetoric. It all kind of reeks of a bit suspicious from my perspective of how this has come about. And you're absolutely right. I mean, and then on the flip side, of course, you're going to have Rex Tillerson who'll be tearing his hair out, going, "I just don't believe what I'm hearing," because Tillerson has tried to play the good guy and tried to take the correct diplomatic approach to North Korea, which is to sit down with the North Koreans at some point in the future, but certainly to discuss it with the Chinese and the Russians and the South Koreans, how to de-escalate tensions and come to a amicable solution with respect to North Korea. But I think what is interesting, and we did speak about it on Monday, but it's worth mentioning again, was the fact the UN Security Council resolution whereby all nations, i.e. China, Russia, and the US, and all the other parties signed off on more sanctions against North Korea. Now, that would suggest in the minds of the Russians and the Chinese that they do take the threat of North Korea serious to some extent. I'm not suggesting they think they're going to launch a nuclear strike, but I do suspect that they are fearful that North Korea may launch some strike against South Korea, for example, and that's always been a possibility. We must be careful that we don't suggest North Korea couldn't do something stupid and insane. Now, if that is the case, I think that suggests grave instability inside Pyongyang rather than as much as them feeling that a preemptive strike is going to come just as a matter of course. Because, I mean, I've heard the North Koreans for years come out with these statements they were going to bomb the US into the Stone Age, etc., etc. I mean, we've heard it for years and no one took it particularly seriously. Now, okay, we're in a different time, a different world, and unfortunately, the war hawks inside the administration know full well that the world's changing. The US economy is weak, and the US is economically, politically, and socially weak. Militarily, it's quite weak, hence its stance in the Middle East. So it's looking to try and flex its muscles in some ways. Because unfortunately, the war hawks, that's all they know. Let's go to war. That's their answer to everything because a war solves all their problems. And in the process, in going to war, they hope they can then steal assets of nations and rape and pillage them for everything that's of worth, then just walk out and leave them to fall into total disrepair and decay, which is a classic case in Libya. So I do think they're all things that we also need to factor into our thinking. I mean, it's very difficult at this point because I remember back when this all sort of started around probably 4 months ago, there was a lot of tension and concern regarding North Korea at that point, and it all kind of simmered and went. And I think that was largely because of Tillerson and sitting down with Lavrov and talking to the Chinese and realizing that what the reality is and what needs to be done. But it's like Tillerson is kind of fighting against the people call it the deep state, the cabal, the neocons, call them what you like inside Washington, who are desperately trying to want a war and doing everything to undermine Tillerson in the process. But it's how much, Tillerson, as I said, and I stand by this, is extremely important to the US, not just in terms of foreign policy, but trying to, in effect, deflect away if there is bogus intelligence coming the way of Trump, to try and impress upon Trump the reality rather than the rhetoric that's coming out of. And there's no doubt there's false rhetoric. We know that because it came out regarding Syria and the whole chemical weapon episode, which of course was bogus intelligence. So there has been a precedent for this, as we know previously.
Yeah, correct. And so now you see the media, working in unison with the deep state in terms of the fear mongering, the fear that they're putting in the American public, trying to gain national support for a preemptive strike. One of the other things that interests me, regarding Donald Trump is his interest in being liked or being popular as a president. And we've, from the beginning of his election, the perfect example I like to give of that is even when he was president, his continued attacks against Arnold Schwarzenegger on The Apprentice. Now, people are probably listening, going, "Okay, where's CJ going with this?" However, he was sitting there, and the whole time that Arnold was, taking over The Apprentice, he was like, look at his ratings. His ratings are well below mine. I was at 85%. And, he just kept this on. And you see Trump going around on these campaign stump speeches. And I agree. Yes, he needs to, continue to build his base, continue that momentum. But the thing that does bother me is that in the form of, if he does become a politician and starts to politicize internally these actions, and listening to the political pundits regarding, hey, listen, this will do great for your ratings as president. You're slumping right now. They're reporting that you haven't had a win in the Congress or Senate. A lot of people are questioning whether you're even going to be able to get reelected in 2020. You really need a win right now. So this would do very well for your ratings. Look what it did for George W. Bush after he started bombing Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, his approval ratings jumped up, I think, to the high 70s at least, if not higher. Does that concern you at all, Paul, regarding Trump's mentality?
Yes, absolutely. And you raised that we had it in the UK when they had the Falklands War back in, my memory serves me right, 1982. At the time, the Thatcher government was deeply unpopular. And of course, they had the Falklands War happened, and the popularity went through the roof, and they got a huge majority of the election, which I think happened in 1983. So there is a precedent for leaders to, like we said, the same as what the Saudis have done with respect to Qatar, and probably why Kim Jong-un's doing what he's doing in with respect to North Korea. So yes, there is and I do think you're absolutely right. There is someone there might be saying, well, now's a good opportunity to flex your muscles a bit, and tell the American people we're the most powerful nation on the planet, and you might get a 10-point swing in the American people's minds as to you being the strong, dominant, forceful leader. And yeah, I think that is a concern. And he needs to appreciate the fact that on the world stage, the Chinese and the Russians are going to look at this and go, I mean, do we take him seriously? I mean, what kind of nonsensical rhetoric is there? And it's not, ultimately, it might win you an opinion poll at home, or might, raise your profile in the US. But the reality is it's not doing the US any favors on the world stage. And right now, the US needs friends on the world stage, not enemies. And that is a big problem. But this is the problem when you have a president who is actually trying to be a real president. Whether he does whatever he does, right or wrong, and I don't agree with a lot of the things he said. I agree with some of the things he said, but he's actually effectively a president without any mandate from his own party, even never mind the Senate, etc. So he's in a very difficult position. We know through the US sanctions against Russia recently that they effectively forced him into signing them. He had no choice, and that's not a great position for an American president to be. And whether the US people will look at that and go, well, actually, yeah, that's the reason he was kind of forced into it, or just go, my goodness, what a weak president we have. He just gets rolled over and is forced into signing things without actually having any mandate to do otherwise. So it is a very difficult, but you raise an excellent point that, trying to win an opinion per poll or opinion ratings with the American people, you can see why he's doing it, but it's also very dangerous in the process of doing it, particularly when you make remarks about we will never have to use this nuclear power we've got. I mean, it's just high octane rhetoric on a world stage that nations just don't want to hear, and in fact, the risk is, of course, is that we've spoken about Russia and China wanting to take a very passive view of changing, the world into a multipolar world without actually tackling the dollar head on. But we've seen the noises coming out of Moscow regarding the dollar, and there is there will come a crunch point if they feel the world's being pushed too near the edge of some, not oblivion's the wrong word, but some major event that's deeply damaging. They may just pull the plug and say, right, enough's enough. And while Trump's saying what he's saying isn't necessarily going to cause that, it's certainly going to stoke the tensions and stoke the idea in the minds of Beijing and Moscow that now we might have to do something, because we're not just going to stand there. As much as we don't want to attack the US directly and attack the dollar, but if a serious global threat comes to pass, we're not going to sit there and allow it to happen.
Correct, correct. Yeah, and in regards, you made a very valid point as well in regards to the sanctions. I think that that showed that perhaps maybe China and Russia had grown a little bit weary of North Korea and wanted to try to resolve the matter through the United Nations. And that was just Saturday, and here we are, just 3 days later. And the other thing I want to ask you, Paul, is in regards to, again, in regards to North Korea and any type of strategic action that could be taken. I'm not talking about, weapons of mass destruction, anything like that. Would China have better capabilities in North Korea than the United States? And do you think China would consider any type of action against the regime in North Korea?
No, I don't see the Chinese. Well, the only time China, we can never say never, the only time China would respond is if the North Koreans decided to launch a missile into China, which I can't conceive. I mean, never say never in the world we live in now, but that is one of the most unlikely events ever to happen. They're not going to launch preemptive strikes. It's not China's kind of mantra to launch military action against nations. They just don't do it. But it might come to, I mean, there may come to pass that if, for example, North Korea did launch a preemptive strike against South Korea, in particular, is the most likely target. If it does, then there may be an international response to that in which China would be and Russia would be part of a coordinated effort rather than, and that in a way, if hopefully North Korea doesn't do it, but if there is and there's an international response to that, then in a coordinated manner, then I think there would be moves where the Chinese would be supportive of such action to resolve the problem with North Korea. But they're not going to take any preemptive action just to resolve the problem. I mean, and China's been at pains to point out to the world, look, rather like Ukraine isn't Russia's problem, North Korea isn't China's problem. I mean, everyone, Trump put the emphasis, it's down to the Chinese to resolve this problem and get the Koreans into line. Right? Well, it's not the case, and China's been at pains to point that out with total justification in the process.
Right, correct. Great point. Let's shift gears a little bit. So in terms of why we may be seeing some of the escalation in North Korea was the fact that ISIS is pretty much on has been defeated in Syria. The cabal, the deep state is probably furious about that, and now we have Henry Kissinger is out on the stump giving speeches in regards to what he's calling an Iranian radical empire. um, Very interesting to hear this coming from Henry Kissinger.
Yeah, well, it's a classic response. I mean, the issue, of course, always was that, I mean, whatever side of the fence Kissinger's on now, I mean, he's historically been involved in the cabal. He's instrumental in many things they've been involved in. But I mean, kind of has been flip-flopping a bit recently. I mean, he went to the Russians on numerous occasions, kind of trying to persuade Putin to lay off a bit and let the cabal do what it wants to do, and of course Putin said absolutely no chance. Now, of course, you're absolutely right. The timing is as ever is always the issue here, and we know, as you've rightly said, ISIS is on the ropes, or Daesh, whatever you want to call them, is on the ropes in Syria increasingly, also in Iraq. Yeah, they're trying to foment problems in Afghanistan and in the former Soviet republics, all the stands, and obviously into Europe. But their influence is waning in the Middle East. Now, of course, the big grand master plan for the cabal was to redraw the map of the Middle East, including Syria and Israel. And the desire has always been to suppress Iran. I mean, that's why we had the Iran-Iraq war. It's why the Americans have backed the Iraqis up to the point that Saddam didn't do what they wanted to do, and then they removed him. But they always wanted to suppress Iran in the process. And of course, for whatever reason, the nuclear deal came about, and it was the rebirth of Persia or Iran. And of course, we're seeing that on the world stage in their influence in the Middle East. And of course, it's just high octane rhetoric. Iran has got no intention of stomping all over nations and controlling the Middle East. But the rebirth of Iran will see the kind of satellite cabal nations in the Middle East fall by the wayside to a large extent. And of course, we're now seeing how the Qataris are talking to the Iranians. There has been some attempt to normalize, to some extent, the relations between the Iranians and the Saudis, on some level anyway. I'm not saying there's been a huge amount of success, but it's the cabal's biggest fear is because undoubtedly the Iranians will become, dominant's not the right word, powerful is the wrong word, but the strongest nation in the Middle East. And of course, it now has the support of China, it has the support of Russia. It's developing relations with Turkey, which people would never have believed would have been possible given problems they've had in the past. So we're seeing this whole kind of rebirth of Iran as a nation. And of course, that's why the same kind of rhetoric that's been filled with Trump, it's all bogus information. Like Trump believes that Iran's the nation who sponsors terrorism more than anyone else, and it's responsible for fomenting all these problems throughout the Middle East and beyond. And of course, it's absolute nonsense. I'm not saying Iran's a perfect nation. No nation is, but it's certainly been demonized, rather like the Russians have, completely unfairly. So it's no surprise that Kissinger's saying what he's saying. The timing is everything, because it's clearly an indication the cabal have lost or are on the verge of losing their war in totality in the Middle East. And that was one of their big plans. So it's a clear indication of them. They're failing, and probably they're fearful that their total and utter demise is coming a lot sooner. Well, in some eyes, a lot sooner. In some eyes, they didn't even believe it would happen, and now they see the writings on the wall. And it's an attempt to fuel in people's minds that Iran's the big bad ogre, and we have to deal with Iran. And because the attempt always was to get the Iranians to get involved in a war in some shape or form, so they could set off a whole chain of events to destroy Iran in the process and redraw the map. And they've been trying to start a war in Iran for years. I mean, I used to hear people say it's going to happen in 2011, so 2012, and so on and so on. And it's never come to pass. But there is a desperate attempt, which is why, of course, Trump came out with the rhetoric he did, because he had his head filled with ideas that Iran was the problem in the Middle East. And of course, Iran is the least of the problems, and has done a great service to try and rid the Middle East of the scourge of ISIS. And by implication, I think it almost suggests that, well, as long as we have ISIS around, Iran can never be a strong nation. And once ISIS is dead and buried and finished, oh, well, then Iran can become the strong nation. And it's partly also why you through divide and conquer. If you keep all these nations at war, they're never going to sit down for 5 minutes and go, well, we've had enough of this. Let's start, investing in the One Belt, One Road. Let's start talking to Russia and China and developing relations, which of course is exactly what's going on with nation after nation. And that includes the Saudis will eventually, well, providing of course they don't implode before this happens, but at some point they will obviously naturally rotate away from the US as an ally towards the Far East and obviously Russia, and that's ongoing. And this is not really a surprise to talk about this. So his comments come as absolutely no surprise, but the timing, I think, is very indicative that his comments are representative of elements who see the writing on the wall.
Yeah, I agree. I'm so glad you said that, because that's exactly how I viewed it. The same thing is that they are coming to terms with their globalist agenda, and the things that they have put forth efforts is completely coming to an end. Yeah, so it's interesting and to read that and see his comments when in fact, Iran was very instrumental in Syria. Iran was very instrumental in Iraq as well, and the history regarding Iraq and Iran, fueled by the cabal, to force that whole war with them for years, and now the complete Middle East is being rearranged. It's just interesting to read his comments, and I'm glad you mentioned Turkey, because Turkey is, here we are almost a year later since the failed coup attempt, perhaps CIA involved, whatever transpired there. But here we were watching a NATO member or ex-NATO member and their efforts, not only in supporting Qatar. There were some reports coming out in regards to some joint military exercises in Qatar, and now also, Paul, there's some reports coming out in regards to a new military base in Somalia. What is Turkey up to?
Well, yeah, clearly, I think Qatar's a great example. I mean, yes, you make the point that the cabal's one of their biggest failures, and they've been a number of huge failures in recent years, was the failed coup in Turkey, because the reason it failed is the Russians tipped Erdogan off. And from that day forward, Erdogan realized which side is, as we say here, is bread was buttered on. And the reality is that from that day forward, it changed the whole geopolitical structure of that region in terms of Turkey. I mean, yeah, there's teething problems, and there probably will be for some time, but Erdogan's firmly on the side of the Russians now. He sees Syria as a completely different beast altogether than it used to be, where all he wanted was Assad removed. Now he's starting to see concerns with the threat of US involvement in North Korea, which is to allow this kind of Kurdistan in inverted commas, or another Kurdish autonomous nation similar to the one in Iraq. So in terms of Qatar, well, there was an agreement going back some time ago with the Qataris that the Turkish would have a military base there and a presence there, and they very quickly made it clear to the Saudis that, rather like the Iranians would do, if there was a Saudi invasion, the Turks and the Iranians would fight, and of course that would be a massacre for the Saudis, who don't really have a real strong military presence. Their military is basically hopeless. So no surprise once again that, as a demonstration to the Saudis and the rest of the world, that you have military exercises to show to the rest of the world, this is an ally, we will work with them, cooperate with them, rather like when the Chinese and the Russians decided to do a military drill in the Baltic. It was a big indicator. It was telling the world, and we've said about this numerous times, but it tells everyone in reality, we're joined at the hip, we do everything, we coordinate our activities, we work together on everything to do with foreign policy, and internally within our own domestic markets. It's the same kind of answer that the Qataris and the Turks are telling the Saudis and the rest of the Middle East, and the US for that matter. Now, in terms of Africa, well, there are big changes going on in Africa. We know the integration with Africa into the One Belt, One Road, for example. We know the Chinese have taken up a base in Djibouti. It's no surprise to start to see other elements moving into Africa. I mean, Africa has been a continent that has been decimated by the cabal deliberately on every level. It's an absolute travesty to see what is being done to the continent for, well, I can't think in history how far we go back, but it goes back an awful long way. And there's lots of Western nations who have to hold their hand up and take responsibility for that, including the UK, amongst many others. But the issue, from my perspective, is you will start to see changes in Africa. There is a big plan in the future to regenerate Africa, and the One Belt, One Road's part of that. We're starting to see more. China's been kind of inside the African continent for quite a long time in buying up assets and developing them for nations, and we'll see more and more kind of cooperation, not just economically but militarily. And yeah, it's interesting to see Turkey's involvement in Somalia, but I think it's indicative of the fact that we're going to see more and more of these developments as the world changes, and it's probably an indicative of the fact that there's more trust with regards to Turkey now than there has been for a considerable period of time. And But it doesn't mean still that at times they may, Erdogan's going to overstep the mark, and particularly the Russians will just get on the phone and tell him to rein his neck in a bit. But he has his own problems, however people imagine what's going on at home, and some people view it as very extreme action, and I can support that viewpoint. But there was certainly a very concerted effort to remove him from power, and whatever anyone thinks, if Erdogan had gone, it would have put back the Middle Eastern process considerably. We wouldn't be talking about the developments we are now in terms of Syria, Iraq, and also, for that matter, the destabilization of Turkey would have been hugely damaging to the whole region in the process. So on that basis, we should be grateful that it didn't happen. But of course, it set off the whole chain of events, as we said. And hence, I think we'll see Turkey becoming more and more of a prominent member. But of course, in the process, they're going to move away from the West and Washington as an ally in particular. And that includes obviously its NATO membership. And it's now, it's not going to join the European Union in any form. That's self-evident. So it's just another, geopolitical change in that region, and another clear indication. If people think, I still get people contact me going, well, the cabal are in control of everything. They control Washington, they control London, they control, this, that, and the other. But they're not in control, because if they were in control, they'd be winning these huge geopolitical wars that these plans came about from years, decades ago, with regards to the Middle East, and they failed. So that is the indication that they're not powerful. They don't have that power base anymore. They're very weak, and it's why they're lashing out in terms of regions like North Korea, for example, and why they're still trying to foment trouble wherever they can, because that's the only answer they've got. But the reality is that the economic one belt, one road, multipolar world is winning out, because nations realize now, do you know what, we can both benefit from this, and we don't have to fire a single bullet to do so. This is a wonderful new way and a mature adult way of conducting ourselves on the global stage, and they're seeing it's a win-win. It's not all about Chinese dominance or Russian dominance, but every day, literally now, we're seeing developments coming out of China and Russia, which shows they're starting to work with the weaker nations in the world, the ones that have been suppressed and for so long, and they're realizing, you know what, this is part of a big change. And Africa is one continent that has huge problems. It has huge social problems. It has huge economic problems, and also there are still wars, civil wars being fought in nations. Sudan's one example of it, but there are huge problems that need addressing, and at some point, Africa will become something we'll probably talk about more and more as time progresses, because it is a continent that has huge assets, it has huge resources and mineral wealth, and it has the capability to become a really vibrant continent. And that is exactly the plan that China and Russia, to a lesser extent, Russia's will obviously be part of that process, but more so the whole infrastructure rebuild of putting rail networks in, and also getting these nations so everybody has a roof over their head, everybody has electricity and sanitation and just a standard of living. That's an enormous undertaking, but it's something that is coming about, and that's why you start the maritime routes, the rail links, and in the end, there are huge, massive infrastructure projects that will take a long time to come to fruition, but it's part of the whole reorder and reorganization of the world, because once African nations become more vibrant economically, they have more opportunity, then that is a huge change. And those nations, once they are given the opportunity, will transform as well. And that's why the One Belt, One Road and all these initiatives has to be a lasting legacy. That means we don't see a return to this kind of cabal insanity in the next, we have 20 years where the world changes, kind of a bit like the post World War II, where it was all rebuilding, the world seemed to have this feel-good factor. And then very slowly the edifice got stripped away and all the insanity started again, and the rebirth of the European Union, which was just mirroring precisely what the the Nazis were trying to do, although not exactly the same, but very similar. We don't want that kind of thing where we have a feel-good factor for 20 years and they come crawling back through the door. This has to be a lasting legacy that is still here in 100, 200, 300 years and changes the world, so we break the glass ceiling of this madness and cyclical madness that's been going on for throughout history, or modern history anyway, at least.
Very well said. Yes, I completely agree that will it'll definitely will be on our radar a lot more as far as the rearrangement of the world occurs. So, Paul, thank you so much for joining today. I really appreciate that and your insights as we continue to watch and the events unfold. And we will be back later today at 12 o'clock p.m. With Hump Day with Bix Weir. So make sure to tune back in for that. And thank you all for listening in. This is CJ and London Paul, and we are over and out.